So this is the Crown traditional rosewood cutting gauge. It differs from your standard marking gauge because it actually has a little blade there instead of the standard steel nail or steel pin. And what that means is you can get even sharper lines if you're trying to reference them for cutting tenons and mortises and that sort of thing than you can from using that standard steel pin. Now this has a few other features that make it a pretty swanky little marking gauge. It has a really nice brass inlay in a rosewood shaft as well as a rosewood plate. It has a brass pin embedded in an actual brass threaded insert, so you're not just threading into the timber, and that provides a really nice solid hold, and you're not going to be creating indents in this brass plate that's going to cause inaccuracies later on. So by placing a blade into this device rather than a pin, it does give you a much sharper line, which really helps with referencing, as I mentioned earlier. Now this blade can be removed by removing this little steel wedge with just a pair of pliers, and then you can actually sharpen that steel blade to make sure that you're always getting the sharpest cut possible. So using this is exactly the same as using a standard marking gauge. You're holding it in the same way, you're referencing that same face, and you're really applying that pressure on the blade at a really low angle, so you're not digging it straight in. So if you're used to using a marking gauge with a pin, you'll find this really simple. You know, you want to do your first cuts really lightly, as with a marking gauge, so that you're creating a little line for that blade to continue to follow. So those first lines are really important to get a beautiful, crisp line. I found this to be really useful especially in soft woods, where a pin will often drag right into the soft meat of the timber and give you a really inaccurate line, where a blade will just cut through really nicely. So I've marked 2 lines in this piece of pine, one using the cutting gauge with the blade and one just using a standard marking gauge with a steel pin. And when you look closely, you can notice a real difference in quality between the sharpness of these lines. The steel pin has really bruised the soft wood in between the grain of the pine and left a pretty mushy line there, which would be hard to follow with a chisel, whereas the cutting gauge has just created a really nice, clean knife line like you would get using a marking knife and a square, which is really useful. Now, it's not as pronounced in a harder timber, but you can still definitely see that effect. So that's one of the reasons why a cutting gauge can be more beneficial to the quality of your work and your accuracy than a standard steel pin marking gauge. So if you're cutting a lot of mortise and tenons, you're actually going to be obviously marking 2 lines for either side of the tenon or the mortise. Now, a marking gauge or a cutting gauge like this only has 1 pin or 1 blade, but you can actually get a mortising gauge which has 2. So there'll be a video about that if you look up mortise gauge. Crown make a bunch of them as well, so it's another really great tool to check out. You can pick up this wonderful rosewood and brass cutting gauge from Timbercon. It's made by Crown Tools in England. It's still made in Sheffield, England, and you can grab that from the Timbercon website at timbercon.com.au or from either of their stores in Perth and in Melbourne.